So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the How to Avoid Accidental Wage Underpayments in the Early Years, supported and hosted by Gary Davis from HMRC, and we'll do formal inductions in a moment. Just a little bit about the session. So what we'll be doing is having a PowerPoint, and I'll be handed over to Gary. The PowerPoint will be about 45 to 50 minutes. We have got some questions already submitted, but we are using the question and answer function for the webinar as well. So my name's Gary Croxton. I'm a business manager for the Early Years Alliance. Just a few things around some of the questions we have. We have had a few questions around holiday pay, and I'm sure Gary will reiterate this as well. But Gary won't be able to answer questions around holiday pay. It is around the the living wage or the national living wage. But if you are members of the Alliance, you can use local, and you can use that as a member benefit as well. So you just need to log on to the members area to find that if it's around holiday pay. So Gary, I'll hand over to you just to do introductions.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Gary Davis, and as Gary Coxon mentioned, I'm part of the National Minimum Wage team within HM Revenue and Customs. And again, today I'm here to talk about national minimum wage. So to give you a bit of an awareness session, so you can avoid any accidental underpayments for minimum wage purposes in the early years sector.
Lovely. Thank you, Gary. So just to reiterate, we are taking questions for Gary. You can use the question and answer function at the bottom of your toolbar, depending on what device you're using. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. Obviously, we're limited on time as well, but Gary has kindly offered, if we don't get enough time to answer all the questions, we'll send the questions on to Gary. He'll put a Q&A together, and then we'll get that sent out to you as well. So without further ado, Gary, I will hand over to you for the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So yes, as I said, I'm part of the National Minimum Wage team within HM Revenue and Customs. What I'm going to do while I'm actually doing the presentation, I'm going to turn off the camera because I'm going to be controlling the presentation, looking at scripts and a few other things as well. So you don't want to be looking at that while I'm doing all of this. So I just wanted to make sure that my camera's on to the beginning, just so you know I'm a human being. So let me just turn this off now. So stop video. Wonderful. So I'm part of the promote team within the National Minimum Wage team. And it's my job really to try and promote awareness to employers like yourselves, just to get the national minimum wage right. We do things like webinars, writing content. It could be absolutely anything, because we want to try and get the message out there, because we want to make sure that workers get paid at least the minimum wage from the get-go. So everything is fine going forward. So all these slides are actually going to be at the end, so I just need to skip all of this. And I just want to again thank Gary Coxon and the Early Years Alliance for allowing me to do this for everybody today. So let me get to the right slide. So as I said before, as Gary said beforehand, we're hoping this webinar should last about 45 to 50 minutes. And again, any questions that you can think of, feel free to put them in the chat. But just to reiterate, I can't answer anything about holiday pay because I've got no idea about it. I don't deal with holiday pay. I just deal with the national minimum wage. It's the same thing with taxes. I can't answer anything about taxes. So before we get started, here's what we'll be covering in today's session, which is the national minimum wage basics, the entitlement, national minimum wage rates, pay reference periods, what counts as pay, which is a very important one. And then we're going to talk about allowances, deductions and payments, unpaid working time, and then we can finish off with a bit of a summary and where you can find further help and support. So with national minimum wage, as I used to be a compliance officer investigating many, many companies, what I've learned is that mistakes are very easy to make and you may not know that you're making them. And I remember all those years ago, just before I joined the national minimum wage team, I thought, national minimum wage is easy. It's just X amount per hour. How difficult could it be? Oh, how wrong was I? How naive I was. Because it all comes down to the granular details. For instance, what is pay for national minimum wage purposes? And what's working time for minimum wage purposes? And that's where employers like yourselves tend to make mistakes just by accident. So let's talk about the essentials before I start talking about specific risks to the childcare sector. Now, the national minimum wage is all about rates of pay in a pay reference period. This is essentially pay divided by time. Being able to work out pay and time is really important for minimum wage purposes. And pay covers things like, say, payments, deductions, and what does and doesn't count towards minimum wage pay. Time, well, that covers the area of working time and what does and doesn't count under that term, and how different elements of time affects a worker's minimum wage entitlement. Now, in this webinar, we're going to look at what exactly counts as pay for minimum wage purposes, essentially what's included and what's not. And I'm going to focus on things that affect workers' pay, like deductions and payments from a worker to you, or even to a third party. Now, it might all appear simple at first glance, but employers make all kinds of mistakes, and it's these mistakes that causes underpayments. And employers may think that they are paying enough, but on closer examination, they are in fact incorrectly including elements of pay that don't count for the minimum wage calculation. When it comes to the time aspect, we're going to be looking at things such as like working time and unpaid time. But before I do, let's talk about entitlement. When I say entitlement, I mean national minimum wage entitlement. So all workers are entitled to receive a national minimum wage, but there are a few exceptions to the rule. But don't worry, I'm not going to go into them all. I'm just going to go into the ones that relate to the childcare sector. So say you're self-employed. If you're self-employed, you don't have to pay yourself the minimum wage. And that, I suppose, relates to childminders. So I'm hoping we might have some childminders on today, and that will probably apply to you. However, if you as a childminder take on an assistant, then you need to pay them the minimum wage if they are a worker. Now, sometimes there's a bit of confusion, and you might think, well, that childminding assistant is actually self-employed, so I'm just going to do them as self-employed. And you can't just call them self-employed. It's all about what happens in practice. And here are some good indicators that the childminding assistant could be self-employed. It could be that they provide their own equipment, like say learning materials, resources, etc. And say if they are unavailable that day, say they're not well, then that assistant can supply a substitute assistant on their behalf. And then the assistant can also decide how and when to do the childminding activities. Another indicator is that say they complete self-assessment tax returns every year and they declare their income from self-employment. Also, say that childminding system, they could work on multiple childminders and or settings, and they have the ability to take on more work to increase their profit or reduce their work and risk financial loss. Now let's stick with childminders for a bit longer and talk about volunteers. Childminders can have volunteers working for them, and if they are a genuine volunteer, then they don't have to pay the minimum wage. I mean, let's face it, really, they're volunteer, they shouldn't be receiving any pay whatsoever. And let me give you a real life example. My wife is a childminder, and she does have a volunteer, and that's me. That's her wonderful and supportive husband. But I don't qualify for the minimum wage because I provide my time and effort completely for free. I can come and go as I please. I'm under no obligation to provide services. I can't be made to perform specific duties. I don't suffer sanctions if I don't perform duties, and I don't receive or expect any monetary payment or benefits in kind. It could be as simple as, you know, I get asked by the wife, is it okay if you can help me out on a trip? I might just think, well, I'll see what's going at work. If it's a quiet day and I can book some leave, wonderful, I can help you out. Oh no, sorry, I'm doing a webinar, I can't help you, sorry. Again, there's no repercussions, there's nothing, it just can't be helped. Therefore, I can do as I please. Now, obviously, volunteers can be in preschools and nurseries and charities and other settings as well. So it's important for everybody to keep this in mind because, you know, it's still important for all legal entities because volunteers, doesn't matter if you're a childminder or preschool or nursery, you would still have the same type of volunteer. So keeping on with entitlement, let's talk about apprentices, because apprentices are entitled to the minimum wage too, but they can be paid at a lower rate. To qualify for the apprentice rate, a worker must be employed under a statutory apprenticeship agreement or a contract of apprenticeship. So it can't just be deemed as an apprenticeship, it has to be a government recognised scheme. Now, if the worker is on a genuine scheme, they can be paid the apprentice rate up until they are 19 years old, or if the apprentice is aged 19 or over in the first year of their apprenticeship with their current employer. So let's give you a couple examples to finish this section off. So let's talk about Lisa. Lisa started an apprenticeship when she was 17 and she's about to turn 19. This is a genuine apprenticeship and the worker has a contract of apprenticeship. When Lisa turns 19, she can no longer be paid the apprentice rate. And now we have Fran. Fran is 24 years old and just started an apprenticeship with her preschool. Now she can be paid the apprentice rate but for 1 year only. After the first year, she can't be paid the apprentice rate and must be paid at least the minimum wage for her age, which is currently £9.50 an hour. Now, speaking of £9.50 an hour, that leads us into our next segment, which is all about the national minimum wage rates. Now, the national minimum wage is the minimum hourly rate of pay due to eligible workers. The national living wage was introduced in April 2016, and it applies to workers aged 23 and over. Now, the living wage is effectively another rate. Employers are legally responsible for paying the correct minimum wage rates. And here's a table showing the current year's rates from April 2022. So as you can see, if you're 23 or over, you get £9.50 an hour. If you're aged 21 to 22, then it's £9.18 an hour, and so on and so forth. So these figures will change again from April 2023, as there is an uplift every April. And the Low Pay Commission give their findings as to what they think it should be, and then it's enacted in Parliament. So we have compiled a new list, as you can see, from April 2023. This is what the new rates are going to be. So age 23 or over, it's now going to be £10.42 from April. That's a significant jump. It's almost £1 more. In fact, age 21 to 22 is exactly £1 more. It was £9.18 an hour. It's now £10.18 an hour. So that's going to be the new rates. Now, earlier before, I said the national minimum wage is all about rates of pay in a pay reference period. Now, a pay reference period is the period of time for which someone is paid. Minimum wage legislation requires that workers must be paid at least the minimum wage for all time worked in each pay reference period. Now, it can be monthly or any regular time period less than that, so it could be weekly, fortnightly, 4-weekly, but it can never be longer than 1 calendar month. Failure to pay the minimum wage for all time worked, even in a single pay reference period, means that there's an underpayment. Now, employers are unable to average pay across different pay reference periods, and that's in an attempt to demonstrate that the minimum wage has been paid. There is an exception to this, and that's workers who are performing salaried hours type of work. And when I say salaried, I mean salaried for national minimum wage purposes. And before I joined the team, I had no idea that it was actually such a big difference, but it really is. It's not as simple as just earning a salary. There are 4 conditions to be met, but don't worry, I'm going to touch upon this a little later when I talk about term time workers. So I've talked about the rates and I've talked about pay reference periods. Let's talk about pay. For national minimum wage purposes, payments paid by the employer to the worker mean actual money payments paid by the employer to the worker in their capacity as a worker before any deductions are made. And this can include performance-based bonuses paid in that pay reference period or the immediate pay reference period following. And that's as straightforward as it gets. But what's more interesting here is the list of payments that don't count as minimum wage pay that you might see in a worker's payslip. And here are some examples. So you've got overtime and shift premiums, you've got allowances, you've got tips, gratuities, service charges and cover charges, payments by an employer to reimburse a worker's expenses, benefits in kind, and loans. And then we've also got advance of wages. We can't include those either. Neither can we include pension payments, lump sums on retirement, redundancy payments, rewards under staff suggestion schemes, or share and share options. And most of these seem pretty straightforward, but there's two of them that we just need to explore in a little bit more depth. So the first one is about overtime and shift premiums. And it's fairly common for employers to pay their staff that little bit extra than their standard rate of pay. And it could be for doing things like, say, overtime, or working bank holidays, or doing late shifts. And if you do pay a premium, it can't be included in the minimum wage pay if the workers are what we call a timed worker. And timed workers are effectively workers that are paid by the hour. Because really, for minimum wage purposes, there are four types of workers. There's salaried, as I mentioned beforehand, there's timed, there's output, and there's unmeasured. And I'll talk a little bit about salaried later on when I'm covering perm time, as I said beforehand. So it's easy for an employer to think that they are paying more than the minimum wage for a timed worker because they're paying them, say, for an overtime premium, but that isn't the case. So let's give you an example. Fiona earns £9.50 an hour, and in January she worked a total of 142 hours at her preschool. 140 hours were her normal hours, but 2 hours were deemed as overtime. Fiona's payslip shows a total pay of £1,358.50, and that consists of 140 hours at £9.50, but then you've got 2 hours at time and a half, which is £14.25. For minimum wage purposes, Fiona would have only been paid £1,349, and that's 142 hours, which is the total amount of time that she's worked, her basic hours and her overtime, but only at £9.50. And that's because you can't take into account of the time and a half rate. It's all got to be stripped back to their lowest rate of pay, which would have been £9.50 an hour. So straight away as an employer, you'd think that you were paying more than the minimum wage. But for time workers like Fiona, she's only being paid the minimum wage. And that means that, say, if there's any unpaid working time issues or deductions, which I'm going to get into very soon, there's a good chance that Fiona would be underpaid. The critical point here is that a worker's lowest basic hourly rate will always be used in a minimum wage calculation if they are a time worker. So the second point that I wanted to make regarding these payments that aren't included for national minimum wage purposes is about allowances. So some employers pay workers special allowances over and above standard pay. For example, if the worker worked in dangerous conditions, or say works on social hours, works in a particular area, for example, London waiting time, that's a common one, performs special duties over and above a worker's normal duties, attends work punctually, and stays on call for work. These allowances don't count towards minimum wage pay unless you consolidate them into the worker's standard pay or they relate to the worker's performance. Now, the fun thing is, there's no definition to determine when an allowance is consolidated into standard pay. So a view has to be taken as to whether the allowance is amalgamated into the overall pay arrangement. So indications that an allowance is consolidated into standard pay can include, but not restricted to, circumstances when the allowance is treated in line with the overall pay package, like say being treated the same regard to the annual pay increases or decreases, and or included in pensionable pay, and or included when calculating any overtime rates. So let's give a more practical example. Over the festive period, the nursery gives a little incentive to their staff. If they have no sickness absences and no lateness in December, they will give the workers an attendance bonus of £100. So, it sounds wonderful. The staff are certainly happy. Sarah certainly is when she receives a pay slip because it shows her basic pay of £1,140, and that's 120 hours at £9.50 an hour, but then also an attendance bonus for £100. But for minimum wage purposes, only the £1,140 will be considered pay. The attendance bonus won't be considered, as it's not actually a bonus for minimum wage purposes, it's an allowance. And it's surprising how many times an employer will say, oh yes, it's a bonus, we can include bonuses, but really what you have to look into is, what are we actually making this payment for? And in this case, we don't think it's a bonus, it's actually an allowance. And that's because the payment isn't connected to Sarah's performance, it's just attributable to Sarah's working arrangement. Not just that, it's not consolidated into her pay because, as you can see, I'll just go back to it. There's an additional line in a payslip. It actually says attendance bonus £100. If it was included in her basic pay, if it actually showed £1,240, things might be a little bit different. So again, we've got another example when an employer may think that they're paying more than the minimum wage, but actually they aren't, because we can't include allowances for minimum wage purposes. So we've now talked about pay allowance, but there's another half to pay, and that's deductions. Certain deductions can reduce pay for minimum wage purposes, and that means there's potential for reducing their pay below the national minimum wage rates. And if that happens, it means there's an underpayment. So just a quick example, Gavin started at a nursery, he's 21 years old and earns £9.18 an hour. And that's completely fine because that is the national minimum wage rate for his age. However, in his first payslip, the nursery deducts a uniform deposit of £10. That means Gavin's first payslip has an underpayment. Even if Gavin had been paid the attendance bonus, like the last example with Sarah, he would have still had an underpayment because attendance bonus isn't a bonus, it's an allowance, and we can't include that in national minimum wage pay. That's the effect of deductions in national minimum wage legislation. They can reduce workers' pay rates. If they go below national minimum wage rates, like I said beforehand, there's an underpayment. Payments such as expenses workers incur in connection with their employment has the exact same effect as a deduction. That too will reduce workers' pay rates. And there are a few different ways that payments and deductions can happen, with each having a different effect on a worker's minimum wage pay. Now, not all deductions and payments have the effect of reducing a worker's pay for minimum wage purposes, but some do. So let's take a look at the different kinds of deductions and payments, as well as their effects on workers' minimum wage pay for the childcare sector. So here's a very popular one in the childcare sector, and that's costs incurred, whether that's through a deduction or the worker paying it themselves as an expense. So if you make a deduction from your worker's pay for any items or expenses that are in connection with the job, it will reduce their pay for minimum wage purposes. And again, that potentially causes an underpayment. And this includes things like uniforms or dress codes. So let's give you an example. Jade works for a nursery with a dress code policy. She's provided 3 tops completely free of charge. Wonderful. But she's then told that she needs to wear black trousers and black shoes. So Jade goes to Primark, spends 30 quid on 2 pairs of black shoes, and then pops into Clark's and spends about £60 on a decent pair of shoes, because let's face it, she's going to be on her feet all day. So I might as well get a comfortable pair of shoes. So in total, Jade has spent £90. Now, yes, Jade could use those shoes and trousers outside of work, but it doesn't matter. Jade has incurred that cost in connection with her employment. That means if Jade is paid on the minimum wage, she's going to have an underpayment because her pay will be reduced by £90. The same applies if the employer simply provides other workwear but decides to make a deduction. The effect is the exact same. But before I move on to the next slide, I just want to say that, say, if a worker does incur a cost, it won't reduce pay if the employer simply reimburses the worker. So with Jade, Jade won't have an underpayment if her employer just reimburses her the cost of that £90. There'll be no underpayment. A deduction by the employer is considered to be for an employer's own use and benefit, where they're free to use that money in any way they wish. Now, the reason why I say this is because when this happens, that deduction reduces national minimum wage pay. And it doesn't matter whether or not the employer makes a profit from the transaction, the worker agrees to the deduction or payment, or the worker benefits from the arrangement, or even if it's completely voluntary, it doesn't matter. It would still reduce pay. So let's put a bit of context to this for the childcare sector, say nursery fees for workers, and we find it very common for workers to have their children in setting and the nursery will deduct their fees in the payslip because it's easy, it saves time, and the nursery is guaranteed the payment. The problem, however, is that the nursery, i.e. the employer, is deducting the fees through the payslip, and that they have own use and benefit of that deduction because they can do what they want with those funds. And again, it doesn't matter, even if the nursery will charge a reduced rate and the worker is benefiting from the arrangement, the deduction will always reduce national minimum wage pay. So as an example, Eva is a nursery practitioner. Her employer is offering her half-price childcare costs of £30 per day. The total amount for the month will be deducted through her pay, and it's completely voluntary. Eva isn't forced into it, and she's definitely not turning it down because why would she? £30 a day for childcare? It's a bargain. And Eva is 26 years old, and she earns £9.75 an hour. In the month of February, she's worked 120 hours and has used 12 days of childcare. So Eva's clearly being paid a little bit more than the minimum wage. And her payslip looks a little bit like this. So you've got your basic hours on there, which is 120 hours at £9.75 an hour, and that comes to £1,170. But then you've got the nursery fees on there for £360. For minimum wage purposes, her pay is actually £810, which is 1,170 minus 360. That means Eva has underpaid because she needs to be paid a minimum of £1,140 when working 120 hours. Now, there's a way for the nursery to charge fees without reducing Eva's pay, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later because that's about an exemption, and I've got an entire segment on exemptions for this. So for now, I just want to give you some more examples about deductions within the childcare sector, and that leads us into training. So training is another good example, and it's a common practice with employers to try and recoup training costs from workers if they leave within a certain amount of time. But the problem, however, is that if the training was mandatory, that deduction for training will also reduce minimum wage pay. So let's give an example. Sarah hands in her notice. Her employer deducts £50 in Sarah's final payslip because she's leaving 6 months after completing her safeguarding training. As the safeguarding training is mandatory, that £50 deduction will reduce Sarah's minimum wage pay. Now, it's a little bit different for voluntary training. Voluntary training is, say, you've got a worker that wants to do further education in their field, but it's not a requirement of the job. But the business decides to fund this because they think it's a good idea. So imagine the exact same example, but this time Sarah's handed her notice after completing her voluntary training and after receiving her qualification. The employer decides to make a deduction for the course fees, and as long as this is noted in the employment contract and her leaving will, within a time frame triggers that deduction, it will not reduce national minimum wage pay. So there's a big difference between mandatory training and voluntary training. And I want to stress all of this is when deductions is for the use and benefit of the employer. If the employer is acting as a facilitator, say a middle person, then that's completely fine. For example, workers being part of a union, because the contract is between the worker and the union. All the employer is doing is deducting a fee for the union and paying it to the union itself. That's it. And that goes same with the DBS check. So a DBS charge, that itself, if you make a deduction, that won't reduce national minimum wage pay. But what I need to advise, however, is that the admin fee, so say if it's charged by you or a company processing it and you're passing on this cost to the worker, that admin fee will reduce pay for national minimum wage purposes. So you really have to be careful regarding that. Now, as long as there's an audit trail, HMRC is of the view that the employer does not have use and benefit of the deduction if the deduction is paid to someone else, and therefore that deduction will not reduce national minimum wage pay. There is a small list of exemptions in minimum wage legislation where deductions don't reduce national minimum wage pay. And I'm going to give you that list shortly, but for now, I'm just going to finish off the EVA example because this relates to the exemption. And this exemption is all about payments for purchases of services, payments for purchases of services and goods from the employer. So as we mentioned beforehand, this is the person that had nursery fees deducted from her pay. So say instead of a deduction, as long as EVA paid for the goods or services outside the payslip, so this could be through debit card, cash, bank transfer, PayPal, anything, and the company isn't forcing the payment on the worker, then that payment won't reduce a worker's minimum wage pay. It's exempted. When I say forcing the payment, what I mean to say is that, say, EVA's not obligated to bring her daughter or her son into work just because she's working at that nursery. They don't say, well, because you've got a child, you've got to bring them here, and then we'll have to charge you. That would reduce pay because it's in connection with their employment. But if it's completely voluntary and it's outside of the payslip, then there will not be a reduction in national minimum wage pay. Everything is fine. So those small list of exemptions. So without further ado, here they are. I've got a couple of pages worth. So the first one is tax and national insurance. So you know what's deducted. Pay-as-you-earn national insurance being passed over to HMRC, that won't reduce pay. Student loans, that won't reduce pay. And this is going to be a fun one to read. Deductions from pay allowed under the workers' contract which relate to the misconduct or related matters such as negligence or payment by the worker of a specific penalty or in respect of any other event for which the worker is responsible and contractually liable. To cut out all that legal speak and jargon, it's basically the example I used with Sarah about voluntary training. It's what I like to call contractual deductions for misconduct. As long as then something has happened, it's in the contract, and again, it usually tends to be misconduct or then basically leaving, it won't reduce pay as long as I said, it's in the contract. But we've also got deductions from pay or payment by the worker because of an advance of wages or loans. So it could be you might have a worker that wants an advance, that's fine. So you give them a lump sum payment, then you make deductions in future pay. That deduction won't reduce pay for minimum wage, and it's the same with purchases of shares. So if you provide share options to your staff, that's completely fine. That deduction won't reduce pay either. Accidental overpayment of wages. This is rather common. Say if you have workers that you've accidentally overpaid, then you need to deduct this amount from their future pay slips. Again, that amount won't reduce pay either. Then voluntary payments for goods or services, like the EVA example, but remember, payments, not deductions. If it's a payment, it won't reduce pay. If a deduction, unfortunately, it will. And then finally, accommodation. Accommodation won't reduce national minimum wage pay as long as it's up to the accommodation threshold. And there we have it. That's the pay element for national minimum wage purposes. So we've talked about what's classed as pay and what could reduce pay. And now we need to talk about the other part of the equation, which is all about working time. So employers and workers can fail to recognise time spent working that is unpaid. For minimum wage purposes, working time includes time spent working and time that is treated as working time. And that's something that we're going to expand on. This can include times when the individual is required to be at work or when they are waiting for work. This is actually a common cause of an underpayment for minimum wage because unpaid working time reduces a worker's pay, potentially taking rates of pay below minimum wage rates. Now, small periods of unpaid working time, even those lasting only minutes, can directly lead to an underpayment of the minimum wage especially for those workers who are like paid bob on the minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage rates. And let's give you a quick example, which I'll expand on again later. So Shawnee is paid the minimum wage. She is told by her nursery that she needs to arrive 10 minutes before the start of her shift, just to make sure she's ready for her start time, basically. And under minimum wage legislation, this is still classed as working time. The additional time worked without any extra pay has the effect of reducing Shawnee's hourly rate of pay. As she's on the minimum wage, Shawnee would be underpaid. Now, additional working time added onto a worker's shift can be before their shift starts or even after it's ended. And this type of unpaid working time often involves only small amounts of time, but can have a cumulative effect if it's occurring on a regular basis. And I remember doing a compliance check with an employer. It wasn't a childcare one, it was like a distribution centre, but they were still coming in a few minutes early just to have like a bit of a pre-meeting. There's only a few minutes a day. And I remember the employer was saying to me, well, come on, it's only a few minutes. And did a quick calculation. I think it kind of came out to around about 15p per day per worker. And it's like, well, it's only 15p. Yeah, but remember, that's 15p per day, 5 days a week, 40 odd weeks a year, over 6 years, it all adds up. So it's really important to take that into account. It really does all add up. Examples of instances where additional time can be added onto a worker's shift. For the childcare sector, some examples that we found is being told to arrive before the shift, like Shauna's example. Having team meetings after business hours, because I suppose it's very difficult to have them during business hours with ratios and number of children and staff being available and such. Then having to stay later if parents have not picked up children. It happens. You've got emergencies sometimes, you just have to stay later. And then you've got training at home. And then you've also got completing admin or paperwork outside of working hours. And then you've also got traveling between sites if you're a business that has multiple childcare settings. So that too is working time. So let's expand on some of these examples, shall we? And we can go back to Shawnee, so just a little bit more detail. So as we said, Shawnee works for a nursery. She works the same hours every day, which is 8:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. and she is paid £9.50 an hour. So that is the national minimum wage rate for her age. Shawnee is told she must arrive 10 minutes early, and that's so she's available to work when the doors open exactly at 8:30 a.m. So Shawnee does this. She comes into work no later than 8:20 every morning. For minimum wage purposes, this is working time, and Shawnee will be underpaid. Why? Because the nursery is giving her direction and she must be at work. And that's even if Shawnee isn't being productive. You know, she's being told by her employer she must be at work for a certain time. So she might not be productive. She might be just coming in, making a brew, talking to her colleagues about non-work related things like what's on TV. It could be anything whatsoever. But either way, it still needs to be paid for because it's working time. She has to be there. She's got no choice, basically. So let's give another example. Hannah needs to complete her health and safety training online. She is given time at work, but she can't actually do this because it's too busy. As it's too busy at work, she completes the training at home as she's reminded it needs to be done. Now, this too is working time. If Hannah isn't paid for this work at home, for this training at home, she could be underpaid. So let's give another example. This one relates to traveling between sites. So some workers may be asked to travel between different sites. So for example, Sarah works for Nurseries Incorporated Limited, and I apologize about the name, it's not exactly original, but I couldn't think of anything. And this business, this Nurseries Incorporated Limited, they've got 3 nurseries within a 15-mile radius. And due to staffing levels in one site, Sarah is asked to go to one of the other nurseries just to help build up the numbers and such. So Sarah is asked when she has already turned up for work at her normal location, at her normal site. After she is told, she just promptly drives to the other location. Now, the drive from her home location, the drive from her normal location to the new site is working time for minimum wage purposes and must be taken into account when paying her. It's not a break, it's traveling time, and under minimum wage legislation, traveling time is working time. So another example for Sarah, say for example, Sarah is told the day before that she needs to go to the site tomorrow. So that's fine. So instead of going to her normal nursery location, she just travels straight to the new location from home. Well, when it comes to minimum wage, the commute from home to work and vice versa isn't working time. So her employer doesn't need to pay her for this time because it's the normal commute. So that's the difference, I suppose. Okay, everybody, now it's time for our final segment, which is about term time. A popular question that we have on our HMRC webinars is, what about term time? Can we pay workers a fixed amount per month, even though some months they will be working more or even less hours? And the answer, in a word, is yes. Well, that's the short version, unfortunately. There is a longer answer, and that's for those of you who pay or intend to pay workers over term time. So like I said beforehand, there are 4 worker types: salaried, timed, output, and unmeasured. Now, if you want to pay workers the same time each month, but their working hours could change, then the worker type would need to be salaried. If not, they could be underpaid. So if they were timed or measured, they would be underpaid. You can't average. But with salaried, it's a little bit different. What salaried hours work does is to give flexibility to workers on how they work their hours in a calculation year, as long as they are paid an equal part of their annual salary every pay reference period. But what does that mean in English? So I'm hopefully going to explain this through an example. So salaried for minimum wage purposes is calculated in a yearly period called the calculation year. So let's say my calculation year is the 1st of January to 31st of December each year, every year. And in my contract, I'm supposed to work 1,924 hours per year. And I'm paid £2,083 every month in that calculation year. Now, in theory, I can work as many or as little hours every month. What's important is that I'm paid the same amount each month in that calculation year. Now, here's the common pitfall salaried workers have. The employer needs to make sure that the worker is not working more hours in their calculation year than what they're supposed to. Otherwise, there could be an underpayment. For example, by the end of the calculation year, if I worked more than 1,924 hours, but only receive my standard pay of £2,083, then I could be underpaid. An employer really needs to make sure they're keeping working time records to perform these types of checks, because if they don't, how can they demonstrate the minimum wage was actually paid? And I used to get this a lot when I was doing compliance checks. The employers say, oh no, they're all salaried, so we don't keep working time records because, you know, as long as they're paid minimum wage on average, it's fine, isn't it? I'm like, no, that's not how salaried works for minimum wage. If anything, when it comes to salaried, it's even more crucial and even more important to keep working time records, because you need to make sure within a specific calculation year, that person hasn't worked more than their basic hours. Because in theory, if they have, they need to be paid for it. If they don't, then there's a potentially that they're going to be underpaid. Now, not everybody can be salaried, as there are 4 conditions to be met. Condition 1 is that the worker is entitled under their contract to be paid for a set basic number of hours in a year. So that's what I was talking about beforehand. The 1,924 hours example, we would expect to see that in the contract, like the yearly number of hours. If not, as long as the employer can ascertain the yearly number of hours, it's fine. So it could be putting in 37 hours a week in the contract or putting the monthly amount. It's just as simple as timesing it by 52 weeks of the year or timesing it by 12 months of the year. Condition 2, they are entitled under their contract to an annual salary for those basic hours. So we would expect the contract would say that it would be a yearly amount of their salary in that contract in association to those basic hours. The third condition is that the workers are not entitled under their contract to any other payment for their basic hours other than the salary or performance bonus or even the salary premium. So we wouldn't expect any other form of payment except the pay, the basic pay, performance bonus or salary premium. And then the last condition, condition 4, is that they are paid not more often than weekly and not less often than monthly in equal installments. So this basically means as long as they get paid equal installments every week or every fortnight or every 4 weeks or every month, then it's fine. Alternatively, they can be paid in monthly installments that vary, but they must add up to the same amount in each quarter. Now, salaried can be a very tricky area. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be giving Gary Proxon a handout, and it's going to have all the links on there for the National Minimum Wage Guidance. I very much recommend that you look at this handout and look at the links, because it can be a very complicated area, and I've just given a very light touch on this topic. So again, it's a really good idea just to read the guidance for a more in-depth look. And there we have it. Thank you all for hearing me waffling on for the past 45 minutes about national minimum wage. So here's a summary of what we've covered today. We've covered the basics on minimum wage, the entitlement, the national minimum wage rates, pay reference period, what counts as pay. We've got about allowances, deductions and payments, unpaid working time, and then term time. For some reason, I haven't put it on the slide, but we've talked about that as well. Now, for more information, again, I can send out that handout, but we've also got HMRC community forums where you can ask questions, but there's also ACAS. So ACAS is the body, say if you've got a question about minimum wage, it could be as an employer or worker, they can give free impartial advice because they are trained in national minimum wage as well. We also have recorded webinars. So HMRC do webinars a little bit like this, but we also record them and it's on our GoToStage platform. And this link will also be in the handout. That's basically it in relation to the presentation. And now I just want to try and answer as many questions as I can. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And I'll pop my camera back on now. So just give me one moment. Wonderful, right, I am back. So, Gary, I will let you ask the questions so people don't have to put with my boring voice.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that, Gary. It was yeah, some good examples as well. So we did ask for people to submit questions beforehand, so I'll go over those ones that we've got. We've got a few in the Q&A as well, and just one in the chat as well. So let me start from the top. So we are a charity. Is it acceptable to ask our staff to volunteer on an unpaid basis for fundraising events?
Okay, so when that happens, really, if you're employing staff, you can't just say, well, at one moment they're a normal worker and then they are a volunteer. It doesn't really work like that. What I would say is that, no, you would have to pay them at least the minimum wage because they're just a normal worker. If you then take on additional staff that are just a volunteer and nothing else, and they don't do any other work for you at all, and they meet the volunteer criteria, that's completely fine. But if you've got your normal staff just coming into extra hours and not paying them, no, you've got to pay them, unfortunately.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Gary. There's also one, and I know we discussed this previously with the question, and you just wanted to explain the process. So I'll give just an overview of what it was. So somebody was asking, why do HMRC seek to fine and name and shame companies who make genuine mistakes and correct them? And this person had made a mistake and they had been fined an underpayment. But Gary, I know you just wanted to put into context the process that should happen with regards to that.
Exactly. So I'm on the promote team, so we promote awareness for minimum wage, but we've also got an enforcement team, and it's their job to make sure that workers have been paid at least the minimum wage effectively. And this goes through either worker complaints, or it could be normal targeted enforcement where we use HMRC internal data and we just do routine compliance checks. So say, for example, you do this webinar today, you find an issue from what I've talked about and you correct it. So without any HMRC involvement for a compliance check, in theory, what should happen is that you correct it going back, so you repay any arrears, you correct it going forward so it doesn't happen again, and that's it. There shouldn't be any issue. If HMRC comes down later on down the line, there shouldn't be any penalties or any naming because effectively you've self-corrected. You've done it all yourselves. It's not part of the HMRC investigation. So I know with that question, it seemed a bit odd. There could be reasons behind it. It could be that the repayment of arrears that were identified, that didn't happen until HMRC got involved with the compliance check. But what we want to advise people is that whenever HMRC is promoting information, that's not a compliance check, that is just trying to give you information as much as possible so you can correct things going forward. Our job is to make sure that workers are paid the correct amount of money effectively. But when our compliance teams get involved, unfortunately the sanctions, if there is an underpayment, then yes, there are penalties. It's naming. So say the naming is a BAYS policy and they own the national minimum wage legislation. HMRC enforces it on their behalf. But the penalty is currently 200% at the moment. The only relief, I suppose, is that say the employer pays within 14 days, I think it is, then the penalty is reduced by half. So there are quite harsh sanctions, and this is why I'm trying to get the message out there as much as possible so we can avoid the penalties and, more importantly, get workers paid the right amount from the get-go.
Lovely. Thank you, Gary. And then another one we had that we you have answered this, but I will still ask the question because somebody put it forward. So we have often had colleagues who have children in the setting and they ask us to deduct the childcare fees from the wages. But they did get a letter from HMRC saying they cannot do that now. So what is the safest way to deduct such payments? And what is the easiest way to work out if they have fallen below the minimum wage?
Wonderful. So that's probably one of the letters that I've actually sent out. I did send out letters to childcare employers regarding this. And the best way to do it, as mentioned in the presentation that I said beforehand, is keep it out of the payslip. Don't involve the payslip whatsoever. As soon as you've deducted it, that's it. There's going to be an issue. But say if you just treat them just like a normal customer, you know, pay it through BACS, through PayPal, or however you charge your customers, it's completely fine. As soon as it's in the payslip, there's an issue. I know it's convenient and I know it's easy, but again, unfortunately, this is protected legislation. Even though the worker might think, oh, it's just easier, just do it in a payslip. You can't sign your right to rate for minimum wage. Unfortunately, it's protected legislation. So keep it out of the payslip. And if you think that you've underpaid workers, I think the best thing to do is when you get the handout, look at the handout. There's a section about basically doing the review and how to correct it going forward. It'll say about how to calculate underpayments, how to uplift it with the arrears as well, because say, if you've underpaid people from 3 years ago, you have to uplift it to the current rates. That's just part of the NMW legislation. So hopefully you'll be able to know from the handouts.
Thank you, Gary. And then we've got one, and again, you've touched on this within the presentation, but I will say it, but someone was asking, is it true that we have to record daily start and finish times for all staff in order to calculate how hourly pay and complete national living wage checks?
Okay, so you don't have to, but I highly recommend it, because the more information that you have, the more you can demonstrate that you have paid the minimum wage if it has been paid. So if you don't keep the records, how can you demonstrate as an employer that you have paid your workers at least the minimum wage? Because it's not just pay, it's time. You know, it's not just, I mean, I've had it beforehand with employers to say that, oh, well, you know, they're salaried, so it's all fine. You know, they do 37 hours a week. Yes, but how do you know they're doing 37 hours a week? What happens if they've got to come in earlier or later? How's it all recorded? So as long as you've got recording mechanisms in place, then wonderful. All I can say is that if you don't record it, then you open yourself up to quite a few issues. And not just that as well, say if HMRC isn't involved, say if it's between you and the worker can take an employer to an employment tribunal, and the onus would also be on the employer to demonstrate that they've paid the worker at least the minimum wage. And without daily records, it's very difficult. So it's up to yourself as an employer, and the legislation doesn't actually say specifically what you need to keep. It is up to yourself, but I always recommend an employer to keep as much as basically everything that you can. Keep it all so you can then justify that you are paying at least the minimum wage.
Okay. Just a few other questions coming in, Gary, as well. So someone's put a question in with regards to deductions. So how about hours not worked that are not due to sickness?
Hours that have not worked due to, so basically they haven't been in because they've been sick. Yeah, okay, fine. Again, because it's all about working time. So you might have a payroll system where it's not necessarily calculated per hour. They just get a fixed amount each month, not necessarily salaried, not necessarily timed, something a bit in between, like an unmeasured worker, we would call them. And if it's all about not working, that is completely fine, because national minimum wage is all about the amount received due to their working time. So that's fine. All you have to do is to demonstrate that that worker has been paid the national minimum wage for all of their time work. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so this one came up when you started talking about traveling time. So do we need to pay for travel time for training?
Yes, it's the same thing. So it could be same examples I used beforehand. You've come to work and then you've got to travel somewhere else for training. Again, yes, that traveling time would still be paid for. Say it could be, trying to think now, I remember my wife had to do a training when she used to work for a nursery, and it was at the weekend, and it was much further away from her place of work. So say, for example, if her work was only 5 miles away from home and the training provider was like 10 miles away, basically they would have to pay the difference really between the 5 and the 10 miles. So yes, that traveling time would have to be paid for as well as.
Okay, great. Okay, so how does pension deduction affect the national minimum wage?
So pension deductions. There's two things that you can do with pensions. One, if it's just like a normal pension, it's all fine. It's facilitation. It's not a problem. All you're doing is deducting something and paying it into a pension company. There's legislation in place, and that's completely fine. But there is an exception to the rule, like there is with everything these days, I suppose, is salary sacrifice. So I didn't mention it on the presentation, only because it's not necessarily a common risk in the childcare sector. It does happen, but only from time to time, and that's workers who have salary sacrifices. Salary sacrifice is taken from their gross pay, and effectively what it is that a worker will sacrifice part of their pay in exchange for something else. So say if I'm on £1,500 a month, and basically let's say it's just the national minimum wage for the amount of hours that I do. So I'm on £1,500 a month. I think, you know what, I don't actually need to work. My wife earns enough money. I'm just in it just so I can pay into a pension. So I decide to sacrifice £1,000 a month into a pension pot. Now I'm happy with this. I get a tax benefit from it. It's wonderful. I'm all for it. This is what I want to do. The problem, however, is because as I'm sacrificing part of my contractual pay, the starting rate for my minimum wage pay is only going to be £500. It was originally £1,500. I've sacrificed 1,000. It's now £500, and that's straight away my pay for minimum wage purposes. So I'm going to be underpaid. So again, it's all about protective legislation. I can't sign my national minimum wage rights away. So that becomes an issue. So really, to summarize, net pension payments completely fine. It's facilitation of pay. But unfortunately, if it's salary sacrifice, that will cause an underpayment if it takes workers' pay rates below the minimum wage.
Okay, just another quick one probably for you, Gary. Do you have to pay training if it's optional and voluntary?
So if it's optional and voluntary, in theory, no, but you have to make sure that you've got the audit trail to confirm that. Because, one person might say, oh, well, it's optional, but, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you've got to go. So as long as there is an audit trail in place to confirm that, yes, this is completely voluntary, you don't need to do it in relation to your job, you're just doing it, you don't have to be paid for that time.
Okay, lovely. Okay, and so our staff are given contracted hours but choose to come in earlier and stay later to complete the task that needs doing, but we're not asking them to do this. So how does that stand?
Okay, funny enough, I was actually asked this question last week as well. So this is going to be more of a conduct and discipline issue, because in theory, you do need to pay for that time. Because even though you're not asking, they are coming in, they are doing the work. So it seems to me like, they've got to come in and do this because maybe it's too busy during the workplace, so they are coming in earlier. Maybe they've got an offset inspection coming soon, so they want to make sure that everything's all in order. Unfortunately, this is pay time. It's like the whole volunteer thing. So technically, you work for the employer, so you're coming in, doing your normal job, and then you're voluntarily coming in. So are you technically a volunteer? Unfortunately not. So for those people that do this, you need to pay them. If you don't want them to do this because you don't want to pay them, you need to advise them to stop. And if they keep doing it, obviously you've got to still keep paying them, but I'm then assuming it would then be a conduct and discipline issue for yourselves, as in between the employer and the worker.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gary. I'm aware of time. Carly, I'm aware you've got your hand up as well to ask a question. So what I'll do, Gary, we've just got one more question in the chat, and then I'll allow Carly to talk, and then
Yeah,
we'll bring the session to a close. So
wonderful.
this is probably just a confirmation question. So with regard to the earlier question and staff being asked to help at fundraising events, if the staff are happy to volunteer and not expected to be paid, is that okay?
No, unfortunately not. Same thing, they're signing their rights away from minimum wage and that can't be done. So again, it's protected legislation. It still needs to be paid for, even if it's voluntary, even if they're completely happy with it. It's the same with deductions. They might be completely happy with the nursery deducting something from their pay for, you know, a reduced rate childcare. It's wonderful, they're happy with it. It's still an issue, and it's the exact same thing with voluntary working. They might be happy doing it. It might be a fun event. They might even benefit from it as well. It's still working time and it does need to be paid, unfortunately.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you. I can see there's a question in chat in regards to holiday pay being backdated. As we said at the beginning, this is about the national minimum wage, not about the holiday pay. So what I would recommend is giving Law Call a call. They did do us a session late last year with regards to holiday pay, and Law Call will be able to help you, but obviously that is an alliance benefit so you would need to be an alliance member as well. Carly, like I said, I can still see your hand up, so I'm going to click allow to talk, so hopefully you should unmute and come into the conversation, and then we will close the session. Carly, can you hear us?
You're on mute, by the way.
Maybe Carly put her hand up by mistake.
Could be. Just to let you know, I've seen a chat come in as well to say that could we pay them less if they're volunteering, and the answer is no, I'm afraid. You just got to pay them at least the minimum wage. Now, it could be that you're paying workers above minimum wage, and it could be that you might have a bit of leeway. Wonderful, but what we say is that you've got to add up all working time in that period, and they've got to be paid at least the national minimum wage for all working time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gary. That sort of brings us just after 7:30. We said we would keep it to an hour. As Gary says, we will send a copy of the handouts that you will get. Gary, are we sharing the slides? Are you happy with that we share your slides?
I would love to, but unfortunately, we're not allowed to share the slides themselves. The video, not a problem, and that's only because of HMRC branding and everything else. So video, fine. PowerPoint, unfortunately, not.
Okay.
Do you want me to go back to the previous slides as well?
I mean, all I was going to say, yeah, if you want to reshare your screen, if there are questions coming up in the chat at the moment, we will take those, and I will put those forward to Gary as well, and then we can come back. But please remember, you have got those contacts from Gary at HMRC, and also the member benefit of Law Call as well. So what I really wanted to do is just bring this to a close, just to give you a little bit of an overview about the Alliance I've got. So we have got our payslip service where we can actually support you to run your payslip and do all those calculations for you. We've got information on there as well, so we will get that information sent out to you in and that will just help support. So like I say, you will receive that as well. And then just to highlight again, we have got other continued professional developments, and we have got a discounted offer on at the moment as well. So I just want to say thank you to Gary for joining us this evening, and it has been informative. I think there's some really useful examples there that we can understand as well. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you on further events, connects, and webinars, and our virtual classroom, our whole Alliance CPD offer as well. So I will stop the recording now. And as I say, any questions that are left in the chat, we will pick those up, and I will forward to Gary after the session. So I will now stop